what is going on with the UK, the European, the US car industry right now. It feels almost, you might say, like Carmageddon. And it's a lot of people are talking about things like Brexit, about political interventions, but actually there's something bigger going on. So I want to take you on a deep dive here through some of the data, and we'll start with the big picture, okay? This is showing you the biggest car producers, car exporters around the world, okay, in terms of how much they're sending out exports. So you've got Japan, you've got Germany, you've got South Korea, the US in recent years. And the big shift we're seeing at the moment is down to the change in cars. So from internal combustion engine cars to electric cars. And look at the biggest beneficiary of that. Look at China. Just look at how it's leapfrogged everyone else in terms of the units of cars they're sending out around the world. What is going on there? Well, part of the story, kind of the big picture here, is it is much cheaper right now to make electric cars in China. Okay, so this is showing you the cost of making a VW i3, okay, ID3. This is a car that's comparable to certain cars that you can find in China. And this is showing you the different component parts, so the battery, the chassis, and so on. And now let's compare that with a BYD Seal. So this is a not dissimilar car in China. 29% cheaper to make in China, the battery. But also look at the other parts as well. All of them cheaper in China. Okay, and the upshot of that is you're talking about cheaper cars. And why is it cheaper? Well, partly it's down to expertise. Partly it's down to other things as well. So, for instance, consider the fact that you have more state aid in China. So subsidies, visible and invisible. Certainly there are subsidies that go to UK and EU producers as well. But the Chinese subsidies, and this is across the sector, it's not looking at a specific company, across the sector are significantly higher, up to 9 times more state aid than you find in the OECD, which is the developed world. So you've got state aid, the government helping out. You've also got tariffs in China as well, by the way. You've got power costs that are much higher here in Europe than they are elsewhere around the world. In fact, look, of all of the countries, the industrial power costs are highest in the UK. And if you're thinking about where you're going to put your factory, that really matters because, you know, it's a big component part of your costs if you're making a car. So you've got power costs higher as well. Whereas in China, usually a lot of the power comes from coal and that's a lot cheaper. Now, there's also something else going on here, which is about the kind of change in industrial architecture we're talking about here. Typically, historically, and this is showing you just the component parts of a car, and this is a combustion engine car, and how much of the costs they comprise. The engine has typically been the hardest thing to build. It's really hard building engines, really, really hard. Actually, China's really struggled to build engines historically because you've got lots of component parts, a lot of work, a lot of skill goes into that 21%. And actually, that's the biggest part by far. However, now look with batteries, it changes the complete ratio here. The battery becomes by far and away the biggest cost, 39%, even more. And making a battery is a very different skill to making an engine. You can't just take these jobs and shift them across there. And that's a real conundrum for people making cars in Europe and indeed in the US. And it's part of the explanation for why right now China is dominant when it comes to making electric cars. 65% of the global market is Chinese. But what's interesting is when you look beneath that, look into the supply chain, look at how many people are making batteries. It's 82% of the market for batteries is China. Look deeper, look at the components that go inside the batteries. That's dominated even more by China. So the anodes, the cathodes, that's 87, 96% with the anode made in China. You see, it's Chinese dominance. So even if you're making a battery, you're still having to get your components from China. And it goes on. So the chemicals, largely made in China. Really the only area where you don't see the red bars, that's Chinese proportions, where you don't see the red bars as high, it's mining, because you can't control where the lithium and the cobalt is actually coming out of the ground. That's a geological issue. There's one other thing that's just worth focusing on, which is it partly about the chemistries? Is it partly about the types of batteries that Europeans chose? Now, a while ago, the EU, and to some extent parts of Asia outside of China, decided they were going to specialise in really high energy density batteries, the kind of thing that gives you really long range. And there's a particular type of chemistry here, nickel, manganese, cobalt. This is the high energy density stuff. China focused on low energy density batteries, a bit cheaper, a bit safer. And most people in Europe were like, well, why are you guys bothering? Because this stuff is where the money is. But look at what's happening now. Because China's got a lot better at making those batteries, you're seeing much more growth in that different chemistry. And the type of battery that the EU specialises in, it's basically plateauing. Look at that. And China's got the growth area. So you see, it's a whole range of different factors that have led to kind of where we are today with that leapfrogging chart. But where we are also is that governments are trying to do something about it. You've got the US, Canada imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. India as well, high tariffs. Turkey, the EU's just come in with tariffs as well. Really the only outlier here, apart from Japan, which mostly tends to buy Japanese, so you don't necessarily need as high tariffs, is the UK. Still, 0% on top of the normal tariff rate for Chinese EVs, making this about the most attractive country in the world to sell Chinese cars right now, especially given you've got that EV rule coming in 2035. Raising the question, what in the end will this spell for the UK car industry?